Hey friends, welcome back to TalkMate English. I'm Adam, and I'm really glad you've joined me today, because this session is going to be something very special for your English growth, especially if you're aiming to move into advanced fluency. Today, we're stepping into the world of C1 and C2 level daily life English conversations, the level where you don't just speak English, you live in it, you think in it, you respond naturally, and you express ideas with depth, clarity, and confidence. So take a deep breath, relax, and let's begin this journey together. At advanced levels, daily conversations are no longer about simple exchanges like ordering food or asking for directions. They become richer, more layered, more expressive. You begin to share opinions, subtle emotions, reflections, humor, the even abstract thoughts in ordinary situations. For example, instead of saying, "I'm tired," a C1 or C2 speaker might say, "I'm mentally drained after juggling multiple deadlines today." Notice how the meaning becomes more precise, more vivid, more human. That's exactly what we're going to practice today, transforming everyday communication into advanced, natural English expression. Let's begin with a familiar daily life setting. Imagine you're meeting a close colleague after work, not just to chat, but to decompress after a long, demanding day. At an advanced level, conversations in this moment often shift toward reflection rather than reporting facts. You might say something like, "Today felt unusually relentless. Every task seemed straightforward at first glance. Yet each one unfolded into something far more complex." This kind of sentence shows emotional nuance, layered thinking, and narrative flow, all markers of C1-C2 fluency. Now let's turn this into a practice exercise. I want you to repeat mentally, or out loud. The day wasn't physically exhausting, but it was cognitively overwhelming. Pause. Say it again. Cognitively overwhelming. Notice the sophistication of vocabulary replacing simpler phrasing like very tiring. Try another. By the afternoon, my focus had begun to fragment, and even minor decisions felt disproportionately difficult. These are the kinds of expressions that elevate your spoken English into advanced territory. Daily life conversations at this level often include subtle emotional honesty. For instance, when talking to a friend about motivation, and instead of saying, "I don't feel like working," you might express, "Lately, I've been grappling with the persistent lack of motivation, not because I don't care, but because I feel mentally saturated." This communicates not only the feeling, but the psychology behind it, making your speech more authentic and relatable. Let's practice expanding simple thoughts into advanced reflections. Take the base sentence. "I stayed home this weekend." Now expand it. "I intentionally stayed home this weekend to recalibrate mentally. I realized I'd been socially overextended and I needed solitude to regain my internal balance." Notice how this transforms a basic statement into a thoughtful, personal narrative. In real life, advanced speakers also soften opinions diplomatically. Imagine discussing a restaurant experience. Instead of saying, "The food was bad," you might say, "The presentation was impressive, but the flavors didn't quite meet my expectations." This maintains politeness while expressing critique, a vital C2 conversational skill. Now let's move into a longer conversational simulation. Picture yourself speaking with a friend about lifestyle habits. You might say, "I've been reassessing how I structure my mornings. I notice that when I begin the day reactively, checking messages, emails, notifications, I feel as though the day controls me. But when I start intentionally, even with something small like reading or journaling, my mindset shifts entirely." This is advanced daily conversation rooted in self-awareness. Let's convert this into a speaking practice paragraph. Repeat after me slowly. I've come to realize that productivity isn't about doing more. It's about directing my energy toward what actually matters. Again, directing my energy toward what actually matters. Feel the rhythm, the calm authority in the phrasing. At C1-C2 level, storytelling becomes part of daily communication. Even routine incidents are narrated with detail. For example, this morning I missed my train by mere seconds, and instead of reacting with frustration, I found myself observing the stillness of the platform. It felt like an unexpected invitation to slow down. This kind of reflective narration signals emotional intelligence in language use. Let's practice emotional description. Repeat. I wasn't angry, just quietly disappointed in my own lack of punctuality. Now expand. It wasn't the delay itself that bothered me. It was the awareness that I could have prevented it with better planning. This layered introspection is characteristic of advanced fluency. Another core feature of high-level daily conversation is the ability to articulate abstract thoughts casually. Imagine discussing social media habits. You might say, "I sometimes feel that constant digital exposure fragments my attention span. It becomes harder to remain fully present in offline moments." This integrates psychology, observation, and personal insight seamlessly. Let's build a practice reflection together. Speak slowly. I've been trying to cultivate more intentional offline time, not as a rejection of technology, but as a way to restore mental clarity. Again, restore mental clarity. Notice how advanced vocabulary blends naturally into conversational tone. Now let's explore disagreement in daily life. At advanced levels, a disagreement rarely sounds confrontational. Instead of saying, "You're wrong," a fluent speaker might say, "I see the reasoning behind your perspective, though I interpret the situation somewhat differently." This preserves harmony while expressing individuality. Practice this diplomatic structure. I understand your point, but my experience has led me to a slightly different conclusion. Repeat it again, focusing on calm delivery. Workplace conversations also become more nuanced at C1-C2 level. Imagine discussing workload. You might say, "I don't necessarily mind working long hours. What concerns me more is the sustainability of that pace over time." This shows foresight rather than complaint. Try this workplace reflection. I'm striving to find a rhythm where productivity and well-being can coexist rather than compete. Again, productivity and well-being can coexist. Feel how advanced speech often balances ideas rather than choosing extremes. Now let's move into social conversations about personal growth. You could say, "Over the past year, I've become far more selective about where I invest my time and emotional energy." This reflects maturity in both thought and language. Practice expansion. I've realized that not every opportunity aligns with my long-term direction, and discernment has become essential. Repeat slowly. Discernment has become essential. Advanced Daily English also uses metaphor naturally. For instance, my schedule used to feel like a cluttered room. Now I try to keep it as minimal and intentional as possible. Metaphors create vivid conversational imagery. Let's practice metaphorical speech. Burnout doesn't arrive suddenly. It accumulates quietly, like dust in an unnoticed corner. Repeat, and feel the descriptive softness of the language. Now imagine discussing friendships. You might say, as I've grown older, I've come to value depth over frequency in my relationships. Expand it. I may speak to some friends less often, but the emotional connection feels far more grounded and sincere. This reflects emotional articulation at C2 level. Practice this relationship reflection. I've learned that meaningful friendships aren't measured by constant interaction, but by mutual understanding. Again, slowly. Daily conversations at this level often end in reflective closure rather than abrupt stops. For example, so overall, despite the chaos of the week, I feel like I'm evolving in the right direction. This kind of summarizing thought signals conversational maturity. Now let's do a longer integrated speaking exercise. I'll give you a full reflection paragraph for shadowing practice. Lately, I've been paying closer attention to how I spend my time, not in a restrictive way, but in a conscious one. I've noticed that when my days are filled with intention rather than obligation, I feel lighter mentally, more aligned internally. It's not that life becomes easier, but it becomes clearer, and that clarity changes how I respond to everything else. Read it again, slowly, focusing on emotional pacing. This is the essence of C1-C2 daily life conversation. It's thoughtful, emotionally aware, diplomatically expressed, and linguistically precise. You're no longer just exchanging information. You're sharing perspective, identity, and lived experience through English. We'll continue building deeper conversational scenarios, more real-life reflections, and more advanced speaking exercises, so your fluency doesn't just improve, it transforms. As your fluency develops into the C1 and C2 range, one of the most noticeable changes appears in how you handle silence and thinking time in conversations. At beginner levels, silence often feels uncomfortable, something you rush to fill. But advanced speakers use pauses as thinking space, as emotional punctuation. For example, instead of reacting instantly when someone asks about your future plans, and you might pause briefly and respond. That's an interesting question. I've actually been reflecting on that quite a bit lately. Notice how the response buys time, while sounding thoughtful rather than hesitant. Let's turn that into practice. Repeat slowly. I've been reflecting on that quite a bit lately. Again, reflecting on that quite a bit lately. This kind of phrasing signals composure and introspection, both hallmarks of advanced conversational presence. Now imagine someone asks you whether you enjoy your current routine. Instead of a quick yes or no, a C1-C2 response might sound like, I appreciate the stability my routine provides, though I sometimes question whether it leaves enough room for spontaneity and personal exploration. This answer shows balance, appreciation, and subtle critique within one sentence. Practice expanding simple answers. Take the sentence, I like my job. Now elevate it. I value the professional growth my job offers, though I occasionally feel the need for more creative autonomy. Repeat, focusing on tone rather than speed. Advanced daily conversation often includes self-observation. You begin to talk about your own habits almost as if you're analyzing them from the outside. For instance, I've noticed that I tend to overcommit socially and only realize my exhaustion once I'm already overwhelmed. This reflective distance adds intellectual depth to everyday dialogue. Let's practice this structure. I've begun to notice a pattern in my behavior. Pause. Continue. Especially when I ignore early signs of mental fatigue. Say it again, slowly, allowing each phrase to land. Another daily life scenario involves decision-making conversations. Imagine discussing a major purchase or life choice. A high-level response could be, I'm weighing the emotional satisfaction against the long-term practicality because both factors carry equal importance for me. This kind of balanced reasoning is typical of advanced speakers. Practice this analytical phrasing. I'm trying to evaluate not just what I want now, but what will sustain me over time. Again, what will sustain me over time? At C2 level, and even casual conversations about weather or environment can become reflective. Instead of saying, it's raining a lot, you might say, the persistent rain lately has created a strangely calming atmosphere, almost as if the world has collectively slowed down. This blends observation with emotional interpretation. Repeat for fluency. The atmosphere feels unusually reflective today. Again. Unusually reflective. Notice how descriptive adjectives enrich even simple topics. Now let's explore conversations about learning and personal development. Imagine telling a friend about improving your English. You might say, I've moved beyond memorizing vocabulary. Now I focus more on internalizing rhythm, tone, and conversational flow. This shows advanced awareness of language acquisition. Practice saying, Fluency, for me, has become less about accuracy and more about natural expression. Repeat twice, letting the cadence feel conversational rather than rehearsed. Daily life conversations at advanced levels often involve expressing uncertainty without sounding confused. For example, I'm not entirely certain where this path will lead, but I feel compelled to explore it nonetheless. This communicates openness rather than doubt. Let's practice that emotional nuance. I may not have clarity yet, but I do have conviction. Again, slowly. Now imagine discussing time management. A C1-C2 speaker might say, I've started treating my time as a non-renewable resource, which has made me far more selective about my commitments. This metaphorical framing elevates the conversation instantly. Practice reflection. Every yes I give externally requires a no somewhere internally. Repeat, absorbing the philosophical tone. Let's move into a social scenario involving invitations. Suppose someone invites you to an event you're unsure about attending. Instead of declining abruptly, you might respond, I'm genuinely grateful for the invitation, though I may need to see how my energy levels are closer to the date. This maintains warmth while setting boundaries. Practice diplomatic refusal. I'd love to join, provided I can create the mental space for it. Again, calmly. Advanced daily conversation also includes expressing subtle gratitude, not exaggerated, but deeply felt. For example, I don't say this often, but your support during that period meant more to me than I articulated at the time. This shows emotional articulation at a refined level. Repeat this gratitude expression. Your presence had a grounding effect on me. Again, grounding effect. Notice the emotional precision. Now let's explore conversations about change. A common daily life theme. Instead of saying, I've changed a lot, you might say, over. The past few years, my priorities have undergone a quiet but profound transformation. This vocabulary reflects introspection and maturity. Practice saying, what once felt urgent now feels optional. Again, slowly, feeling the contrast embedded in the sentence. At this level, speakers also narrate internal conflicts openly. For example, part of me craves stability, while another part resists anything that feels predictable. This duality expression is common in advanced conversation. Repeat, foreshadowing. I often find myself negotiating between comfort and growth. Again. Let's now simulate a longer conversational reflection about weekends. You know, I used to treat weekends as an escape from responsibility, but lately I've begun to see them as an extension of how I want to live overall. Not just rest, but intentional rest. Time that restores, rather than merely distracts. Whether that means reading, long walks, or simply sitting in silence. I've realized that how I spend my free time shapes my mental clarity for the entire week. Read this aloud slowly, focusing on flow and emotional continuity. Now let's shift toward conversations about relationships with technology, a modern daily life theme. I've been trying to renegotiate my relationship with technology, not eliminating it, but setting boundaries around it, because I've realized constant connectivity often comes at the expense of internal stillness. This demonstrates philosophical framing within casual dialogue. Practice this thought. Silence has become a form of mental maintenance for me. Again, mental maintenance. Advanced speakers also describe memories vividly. For instance, when I think back to my early career days, I remember operating almost entirely on urgency, rarely pausing, long enough to evaluate direction. This layered recall enriches storytelling. Repeat for fluency. I was moving quickly, but not always consciously. Again. Now let's integrate emotional, reflective, and analytical language into one extended speaking exercise. Lately, I've been re-examining what success actually means to me. For years, I equated it with visible milestones, promotions, recognition, measurable progress. But recently, I've begun valuing quieter indicators. Peace of mind, emotional balance, the freedom to structure my days intentionally. It's a subtler form of success, but far more sustainable internally. Practice reading this entire reflection slowly, twice, allowing your voice to carry calm authority. This level of daily English conversation is less about vocabulary memorization and more about cognitive expression. You're articulating thoughts as they form. shaping emotions into language in real time. And that's exactly what we'll keep strengthening as we continue. As conversations become more advanced, you'll notice that C1 and C2 speakers often explore not just what happened in their day, but how those experiences shaped their internal state. The focus shifts from events to interpretation. For example, instead of saying, my meeting was stressful, an advanced reflection might sound like, the meeting challenged my patience more than my competence, which was interesting to observe in myself. This kind of sentence reveals emotional intelligence layered into everyday communication. Let's turn this into a speaking practice exercise. Repeat slowly. It challenged my patience more than my competence. Again, patience more than my competence. Notice how the phrasing reframes stress into self-awareness. Now imagine discussing commuting or travel experiences. A simple speaker might say, traffic was terrible today. But a C1-C2 response could sound like, the commute felt unusually draining today, not because of the distance, but because my mind was already saturated before the day even began. This shows how advanced speakers connect external situations with internal conditions. Practice expanding this thought. Physical journeys feel heavier when mental space is already occupied. Repeat it twice, letting the metaphor resonate. Another common daily conversation theme is energy management. At advanced levels, speakers often distinguish between physical tiredness and emotional depletion. For example, I'm not physically exhausted, but I feel emotionally overextended after multiple intense conversations today. This kind of emotional vocabulary signals high communicative precision. Let's practice that line. Emotionally overextended. Again, overextended. Feel how one word carries layered meaning. Now imagine a conversation about personal boundaries. A C2 level expression might sound like, I've been learning that protecting my energy isn't selfish. It's necessary for maintaining emotional sustainability. This reflects psychological maturity embedded in language. Repeat this reflection. Protecting my energy is part of preserving my clarity. Again, daily life conversations also include moments of quiet realization. For instance, I had a small but meaningful realization this morning. I rush through routines so quickly that I rarely experience them fully. This type of observation transforms ordinary habits into reflective insights. Practice articulating this awareness. I want to move through my routines with more presence than urgency. Repeat slowly. At advanced levels, even conversations about food or meals can carry descriptive richness. Instead of saying, dinner was nice, you might say, the meal itself was simple, but the atmosphere around it made the experience deeply comforting. This integrates sensory detail with emotional tone. Repeat for fluency. The atmosphere made the experience memorable. Again, now let's explore conversations about productivity. Many advanced speakers discuss not just output, but alignment. For example, I've noticed that when my work aligns with my values, productivity happens organically rather than forcefully. This shows philosophical framing in daily dialogue. Practice this insight. Alignment generates energy. Misalignment drains it. Repeat twice. Let's move into a scenario involving unexpected change. Imagine your schedule shifting suddenly. A reflective response might sound like, At first, the disruption irritated me, but in hindsight, it created space I didn't realize I needed. This reframes inconvenience into opportunity. Practice saying, disruption sometimes reveals hidden necessity. Again. Advanced conversations also include articulating internal contradictions. For example, I crave progress, yet I resist the discomfort that progress demands. This paradox expression is common at C2 level. Repeat this line slowly. Growth often requires negotiating with resistance. Again. Now imagine discussing social gatherings. Instead of saying, "The party was fun," you might reflect, "I enjoyed the gathering, though I found myself gravitating toward quieter conversations rather than the louder atmosphere." This shows self-awareness within social commentary. Practice. I value depth of interaction over volume of interaction. Repeat. At this level, speakers often analyze their emotional responses in real time. For instance, I noticed myself becoming defensive during that discussion, which made me curious about what insecurity it might have touched. This psychological introspection adds depth to casual dialogue. Repeat foreshadowing. My reaction revealed more about me than the situation. Again. Let's now explore conversations about daily routines and habits in extended form. Recently, I've been trying to redesign my evenings. I realize that if I let the night dissolve into passive scrolling or distraction, I wake up feeling mentally scattered the next morning. But when I close the day intentionally, reading, reflecting, or simply sitting quietly, my mind resets more effectively. It's a small shift, but it changes the emotional tone of the following day entirely. Practice reading this reflection aloud, focusing on emotional pacing rather than speed. Advanced speakers also articulate delayed realizations. For example, it wasn't until much later that I understood why that conversation lingered in my mind. It had quietly challenged an assumption I'd held for years. This shows cognitive processing over time. Repeat. Some realizations arrive long after the moment has passed. Again. Now imagine discussing financial habits. Even practical topics can sound reflective at C1-C2 level. For instance, I've been trying to cultivate more intentional spending habits, focusing less on impulse gratification and more on long-term value. This elevates a routine, a subject into thoughtful dialogue. Practice. Financial discipline often reflects emotional discipline. Repeat. Let's explore how advanced speakers describe learning from mistakes. Instead of saying, "I made a mistake," you might say, "That experience humbled my assumptions and forced me to reassess my approach moving forward." This shows growth-oriented framing. Repeat. It reshaped my perspective more than my outcome. Again. Now we'll move into a longer, integrated daily life conversation practice, blending reflection, emotion, and analysis. You know, I've been thinking a lot about balance lately. Not the perfect, static kind, but the fluid kind that adjusts as life shifts. Some days demand intensity, others require softness. And I've realized that forcing myself into one mode constantly only leads to burnout. Learning when to push and when to pause has become one of the most valuable skills I'm developing. It's less visible than achievement, but far more sustaining internally. Read this paragraph slowly, twice, allowing your voice to settle into the reflective rhythm. At C1-C2 level, speakers also describe hope cautiously. For example, I don't feel entirely certain about how things will unfold, but I feel quietly optimistic about the direction I'm heading. This balances realism with hope. Practice saying, quiet optimism feels more stable than loud confidence. Again, now imagine discussing rest. An advanced reflection could sound like, I've begun to see rest not as inactivity, but as strategic restoration. This reframes relaxation into purposeful action. Repeat. Rest is preparation in disguise. Again. Let's close this segment with a deeper conversational monologue for shadowing practice. Lately, I've been paying closer attention to the signals my mind and body send me. Fatigue, resistance, clarity, enthusiasm. I used to override them in pursuit of productivity, but now I'm trying to interpret them instead, because I've realized that sustainable progress isn't built on force, it's built on awareness. And the more attentively I listen to those internal cues, the more balanced my external life begins to feel. Practice reading this entire reflection slowly, focusing on calm articulation. This is how advanced daily life English evolves. It becomes introspective, emotionally literate, analytically expressive, and deeply human. As your conversational fluency deepens into the C1 and C2 range, one powerful shift begins to happen in how you describe pressure. Instead of labeling situations simply as stressful, you begin to analyze the nature of that pressure, its source, its emotional weight, and its long-term effect on your mindset. For example, rather than saying, I've been under a lot of pressure lately, you might express, the pressure I've been experiencing recently isn't loud or visible. It's subtle, cumulative, the kind that builds quietly beneath daily responsibilities. This type of phrasing demonstrates emotional articulation combined with metaphorical awareness. Let's turn this into a speaking practice reflection. Repeat slowly. It's the kind of pressure that accumulates quietly. Again. Accumulates quietly. Notice how the delivery feels calm rather than dramatic. Now imagine discussing expectations, either personal or external. An advanced conversational response could sound like, I've realized that many of the expectations I feel aren't imposed externally. They originate internally, shaped by my own standards and fears of underperformance. This shows psychological introspection, embedded within everyday speech. Practice articulating this thought. Sometimes the heaviest expectations are self-constructed. Repeat twice. Daily life conversations at this level often include reflections on identity and growth. For instance, I don't feel like a completely different person than I was a few years ago, but I do feel more internally aligned, more aware of what resonates with me and what doesn't. This kind of subtle transformation language is characteristic of C2 fluency. Repeat. Growth feels less like transformation and more like alignment. Again. Now let's explore conversations about decision fatigue. A very real modern daily life theme. A reflective expression might sound like, by the end of the day, I find my decision-making capacity noticeably diminished. Even trivial choices begin to feel disproportionately heavy. This vocabulary demonstrates cognitive awareness. Practice saying, mental bandwidth is finite and easily depleted. Again, focusing on clarity. At advanced levels, speakers often describe emotional recovery processes. For example, after emotionally demanding days, I've learned that solitude isn't isolation, it's restoration. This reframes being alone into something nourishing rather than negative. Repeat this restorative framing. Solitude recalibrates my emotional equilibrium. Again, slowly. Now imagine discussing personal resilience. Instead of saying, I'm strong, you might say, I've discovered that resilience isn't about enduring endlessly. It's about knowing when to step back and recover intentionally. This expresses strength through wisdom rather than endurance alone. Practice. Recovery is part of resilience, not a departure from it. Repeat. Let's move into conversations about uncertainty, a common advanced theme. For instance, I'm learning to coexist with uncertainty rather than rushing to eliminate it. This phrasing shows psychological flexibility. Repeat slowly. Coexisting with uncertainty requires emotional steadiness. Again, daily life at C1-C2 level also includes articulating subtle joys. The small, often overlooked moment, for example. There's a quiet satisfaction I feel when I complete something thoughtfully, even if no one else notices it. This reflects intrinsic motivation. Practice. Private fulfillment often outweighs public recognition. Repeat. Now imagine describing your relationship with time. An advanced reflection could sound like, I've become increasingly protective of my time, not out of urgency, but out of respect for its irreversibility. This elevates time from schedule to philosophy. Repeat. Time feels more sacred as awareness deepens. Again, let's explore how advanced speakers describe mornings. Mornings have begun to feel symbolic to me, less about the start of tasks, and more about the tone I set internally. When I rush, the day feels fragmented, but when I begin slowly, even briefly, the entire day, he unfolds with more coherence. This type of reflective narration transforms routine into meaning. Practice reading this aloud, focusing on smooth emotional pacing. Now imagine discussing emotional triggers. A high-level articulation might sound like, I've been paying closer attention to what unsettles me emotionally, because those reactions often reveal unresolved inner narratives. This shows psychological depth in casual dialogue. Repeat. My reactions are often mirrors of deeper patterns. Again, advanced daily conversations also include articulating gratitude with specificity. For instance, I've grown more appreciative of people who offer calm presence rather than constant advice. This differentiates types of support. Practice. Steady presence often comforts more than solutions. Repeat. Let's shift into conversations about restlessness, another subtle emotional theme, you might say. There are phases where I feel an unexplainable restlessness, not dissatisfaction exactly, but a quiet urge for expansion. This vocabulary captures emotional nuance. Repeat slowly. Restlessness can signal emerging growth. Again, now imagine discussing confidence. Instead of declaring confidence loudly, advanced speakers often frame it quietly. For example, my confidence has become less performative and more internal, less about proving, and more about trusting my process. This shows grounded self-assurance. Practice. Confidence now feels quieter, but more stable. Repeat. Let's now move into an extended integrated reflection for deeper shadowing practice. Recently, I've been reflecting on how I respond to pressure. I used to equate resilience with constant endurance, pushing forward regardless of mental cost. But over time, I've begun to redefine strength, not as relentless persistence, but as adaptive awareness, knowing when to advance, when to pause, and when to redirect entirely. It's a more compassionate form of discipline, one that sustains me rather than depletes me. Read this paragraph slowly, twice, focusing on emotional cadence. At C1-C2 level, our speakers also articulate evolving priorities. For example, what once felt urgent now feels negotiable, and what once felt optional now feels essential. This reversal language shows cognitive evolution. Repeat, my priorities have reorganized themselves quietly. Again. Now imagine discussing social energy, a nuanced daily life topic. You might say, I've realized that my social energy operates in cycles, and honoring those rhythms has improved my relationships rather than strained them. This integrates psychology with lifestyle awareness. Practice. Honoring my energy cycles has created healthier connections. Repeat. Advanced speakers also describe closure differently. For instance, I've stopped seeking loud closure. I've learned to accept quiet emotional resolution instead. This expresses emotional maturity. Repeat slowly. Not all. A closure arrives with explanation. Again. Let's close this segment with a final long reflective monologue for shadowing practice. Lately, I've been paying attention to the quieter dimensions of my life, the spaces between obligations, the pauses between conversations, the moments where nothing externally significant happens, yet internally. Something settles, something clarifies. I've begun to realize that growth doesn't always occur in visible leaps. Sometimes it unfolds silently, through reflection, through recalibration, through simply allowing myself the space to process what life presents. Practice reading this entire reflection aloud, allowing pauses to shape meaning. This is the rhythm of advanced daily life English, thoughtful, layered, emotionally intelligent, and deeply observant. As you move further into C1 and C2 conversational territory, one of the most powerful upgrades in your daily communication is your ability to articulate internal conflict, not just what you feel, but the coexistence of multiple feelings at once. For instance, instead of saying, I'm nervous about the future, an advanced reflection might sound like, I feel a strange mixture of anticipation and apprehension about what lies ahead. Excitement for the possibilities, but caution toward the unknown variables. This layered emotional articulation signals high fluency. Let's turn that into practice. Repeat slowly, a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. Again, anticipation and apprehension. Notice how advanced vocabulary blends naturally into emotional description. Now imagine discussing personal progress. Rather than stating, I'm improving, you might say. My progress feels subtle but steady, less visible externally, yet deeply perceptible internally. This reflects self-awareness beyond surface measurement. Practice this reflection. Internal progress often precedes external results. Repeat twice. Daily life conversations at this level frequently involve reassessing past versions of yourself. For example, When I look back at how I handled challenges before, I notice how reactive I used to be, whereas now I respond with more emotional deliberation. This comparison shows growth through contrast. Repeat. I've transitioned from reaction to reflection. Again, let's explore how advanced speakers describe disappointment. Instead of blunt expressions, they often contextualize the feeling. For instance, the outcome didn't unfold as I had hoped, though the experience itself offered insights I hadn't anticipated. This reframes disappointment into learning, practice. The lesson outweighed the outcome. Repeat slowly. Now imagine a conversation about patience, a nuanced daily life theme. A C2 level response might sound like, I'm learning that patience isn't passive waiting. It's active emotional regulation while time does its work. This philosophical framing elevates ordinary topics. Repeat. Patience is emotional discipline in motion. Again, advanced speakers also describe motivation cycles realistically. For example, my motivation fluctuates, but my commitment remains stable, and that distinction has become important to me. This separates feeling from action. Practice. Inconsistency sustains progress when motivation fades. Repeat. Let's shift into conversations about self-trust. Instead of saying, I believe in myself, you might articulate, I've developed a quieter form of self-trust, less dependent on outcomes, more rooted in my willingness to adapt regardless of results. This expresses grounded confidence. Repeat. Self-trust grows through adaptability. Again. Now imagine discussing change in friendships over time. A reflective articulation might sound like, some relationships have naturally softened with time, not through conflict, but through diverging life trajectories. This shows emotional maturity in relational language. Practice. Distance doesn't always indicate disconnection. Repeat. Daily life conversations also involve describing mental clarity. For instance, there are moments when my thoughts feel unusually organized, as though my mind has quietly aligned itself overnight. This metaphorical cognition language is common at C2 level. Repeat. Clarity often arrives without announcement. Again. Now let's explore conversations about fear. Advanced speakers rarely deny fear, they contextualize it. For example, the fear I feel isn't paralyzing. It's instructive. It signals areas where growth is trying to occur. This reframes fear into guidance. Practice. Fear can function as directional feedback. Repeat slowly. At this level, even discussions about routine errands can sound reflective. Imagine grocery shopping. You might say, I've begun to appreciate the meditative rhythm of routine errands. The predictability creates mental space for reflection. This elevates mundane tasks into mindful experiences. Repeat. Predictable routines create psychological breathing room. Again. Now let's move into conversations about communication itself. A meta-level daily topic. You might express, I've become more intentional about how I communicate, choosing clarity over immediacy and empathy over precision when necessary. This shows conversational intelligence. Practice. Effective communication balances honesty with sensitivity. Repeat. Advanced speakers also narrate emotional recovery after conflict. For example, after the disagreement, I found myself less focused on being right and more interested in understanding the emotional undercurrent that caused it. This reflects maturity in relational dialogue. Repeat. Understanding resolved more than argument ever could. Again. Let's now enter an extended real-life conversational reflection about personal direction. Recently, I've been reevaluating the direction my life is taking, not from a place of dissatisfaction, but from curiosity. I've realized that growth sometimes requires recalibration rather than reinvention. Small directional shifts, subtle adjustments in focus, rather than dramatic change, and oddly enough, those quieter shifts feel more sustainable, more authentic to who I'm becoming. Practice reading this paragraph slowly, allowing pauses to shape its reflective tone. At C1-C2 level, the speakers also discuss emotional fatigue with nuance. For instance, it's not that I feel overwhelmed by responsibilities, it's that the constancy of responsibility leaves little room for mental stillness. This distinguishes volume from continuity. Repeat. Constancy can be more draining than intensity. Again. Now imagine discussing inspiration. A refined articulation might sound like, inspiration rarely strikes me dramatically. It tends to arrive subtly through conversations, observations, or moments of solitude. This reframes creativity into attentiveness. Practice. Inspiration favors the observant mind. Repeat. Advanced daily conversations also include discussing personal values openly. For example, I've become far more protective of environments that preserve my mental equilibrium. This integrates emotional well-being into lifestyle choices. Repeat. My environment directly shapes my inner stability. Again. Let's move into describing long-term thinking. I've started measuring my decisions not by immediate satisfaction, but by long-term alignment, asking myself whether today's choices will still feel meaningful years from now. This time-layered thinking is typical at C2 level. Practice. Long-term alignment outweighs short-term gratification. Repeat. Now let's close this segment with a deep, integrative monologue foreshadowing practice. Lately, I've been navigating a quiet period of internal transition. Nothing externally dramatic, yet internally. Significant shifts are occurring. I find myself questioning assumptions I once held firmly, reevaluating priorities I once pursued automatically. It's not an uncomfortable process, just unfamiliar. Like walking through a familiar place that somehow feels different. And I'm learning to trust that this reflective phase is guiding me toward a more authentic direction, even if the destination isn't fully visible yet. Read this entire reflection slowly, twice, allowing emotional nuance to guide pacing. This is the essence of advanced daily life English conversation. It captures transition, introspection, emotional complexity, and evolving identity through language. As your English fluency matures into the C1 and C2 spectrum, and one of the most noticeable developments is your ability to articulate emotional transitions, not just what you feel, but how your feelings evolve over time. For instance, instead of saying, I was upset but now I'm okay, an advanced reflection might sound like, initially I felt a wave of frustration, but as time passed, that emotion softened into understanding. This type of emotional progression language signals psychological awareness and linguistic control. Let's turn this into practice. Repeat slowly. My frustration gradually softened into understanding. Again, softened into understanding. Notice how emotional movement is expressed rather than just emotional state. Now imagine discussing forgiveness, a deeply human daily life theme. A C2 level articulation might sound like, forgiveness for me, hasn't been about forgetting what happened, but about releasing the emotional weight attached to it. This reframes forgiveness as emotional liberation rather than reconciliation. Practice. Releasing emotional weight creates internal freedom. Repeat twice. Advanced speakers also describe emotional closure with nuance. For example, I didn't receive the closure I expected externally, so I had to cultivate it internally. This expresses emotional independence. Repeat slowly. Internal closure is sometimes the only sustainable closure. Again, daily conversations at this level often involve discussing emotional boundaries. For instance, I've learned that empathy doesn't require absorbing everyone else's emotional burden. This distinction shows psychological maturity. Practice. Compassion can exist without emotional overextension. Repeat. Now imagine discussing regret. Instead of saying, I regret that decision, you might express, I've made peace with that decision, recognizing it was shaped by the awareness I had at the time. This reframes regret into acceptance. Repeat. Past decisions reflect past consciousness. Again, at advanced levels, speakers frequently discuss acceptance. For example, acceptance, I've realized, isn't passive resignation. It's active acknowledgement of reality without resistance. This philosophical framing elevates everyday reflection. Practice. Acceptance conserves emotional energy. Repeat. Let's move into conversations about self-perception. A nuanced daily life theme, you might say. I've become more comfortable with the evolving nature of my identity, less attached to fixed definitions of who I am. This shows psychological flexibility. Repeat. Identity evolves through lived experience. Again, advanced speakers also articulate emotional detachment carefully. For instance, I've been practicing caring deeply without becoming emotionally entangled. This expresses balanced empathy. Practice. Emotional detachment can coexist with genuine care. Repeat. Now imagine discussing disappointment in others. A refined articulation might sound like, I felt disappointed, not because of what they did, but because of the expectations I had unconsciously placed on them. This shows accountability within emotion. Repeat slowly. Expectations often shape the depth of disappointment. Again, daily life conversations also include describing healing processes. For example, healing, I've learned, rarely occurs in dramatic breakthroughs. It unfolds gradually through repeated moments of emotional honesty. This reflects psychological realism. Practice. Healing progresses through consistency, not intensity. Repeat. Let's shift into conversations about gratitude toward difficult experiences. A hallmark of C2 reflection, for instance. In hindsight, but some of my most uncomfortable experiences became catalysts for my greatest internal growth. This reframes hardship into transformation. Repeat. Discomfort often precedes expansion. Again. Now imagine discussing self-compassion. Instead of saying, I'm trying to be kinder to myself, you might express, I've been cultivating a more compassionate inner dialogue, especially during moments of perceived failure. This elevates self-talk into conscious practice. Practice. My inner dialogue shapes my emotional resilience. Repeat. Advanced daily conversations also involve discussing letting go. For example, I've come to understand that letting go isn't about losing something. It's about making space for what's aligned to enter. This reframes release into invitation. Repeat. Letting go creates psychological space. Again. Now let's move into an extended real-life reflection about emotional maturity. Recently, I've been thinking about how my emotional responses have evolved over time. Situations that once triggered immediate reaction now invite reflection instead. I find myself pausing, observing my internal response, and choosing how to engage rather than reacting impulsively. It's a quieter form of growth, less visible externally, yet profoundly stabilizing internally. Practice reading this paragraph slowly, focusing on calm cadence. At C1-C2 level, speakers also describe peace differently. For instance, peace, for me, is no longer the absence of problems. It's the presence of emotional steadiness despite them. This reframes tranquility into resilience. Repeat. Emotional steadiness defines my sense of peace. Again. Now imagine discussing personal responsibility. A refined articulation might sound like, I've been focusing more on what I can influence, rather than exhausting myself over what I can't. This shows cognitive prioritization. Practice. Energy flows where attention is directed. Repeat. Advanced speakers also articulate emotional patience. For example, I've learned to give my emotions time to process, rather than demanding immediate clarity from them. This reflects emotional respect. Repeat. Clarity often requires emotional incubation. Again. Let's move into conversations about hope after difficulty, a deeply human daily theme. Even during uncertain periods, I've noticed a quiet thread of hope running beneath everything. Not loud, not dramatic, but steady enough to keep me moving forward. Practice reading this reflection aloud, focusing on softness in delivery. Now imagine discussing trust in life's timing. A philosophical yet conversational topic. You might say, I'm beginning to trust that not everything unfolds according to urgency. Some things require emotional readiness rather than chronological readiness. This shows temporal maturity. Repeat. Readiness matters more than timing alone. Again. Let's close this segment with a final extended monologue for deep shadowing practice. Lately, I've been reflecting on the emotional journey I've taken over the past few years, not in terms of achievements, but in terms of awareness. I've become more observant of my reactions, more patient with my healing, and more intentional about the energy I allow into my life. It's not that challenges have disappeared, but my relationship with them has changed. I approach them with curiosity rather than resistance, and that shift alone has transformed how I experience daily life. Practice reading this entire reflection slowly, allowing emotional nuance to guide rhythm. This is the advanced emotional dimension of daily life English conversation. where language becomes a vehicle not just for communication, but for self-understanding. As your English fluency settles into the C1 and C2 range, one of the most meaningful developments is your ability to articulate life perspective, not just isolated emotions or daily reflections, but the broader lens through which you interpret your experiences. For instance, instead of saying, "Our life has been busy," an advanced reflection might sound like, "Life has been unfolding at an intense pace lately, though within that intensity, I've begun to notice moments of unexpected clarity." This layered phrasing blends observation with interpretation. Let's turn that into practice. Repeat slowly. Moments of unexpected clarity. Again. Unexpected clarity. Notice how the phrasing transforms busyness into awareness. Now imagine discussing life direction in a casual conversation. A C2-level articulation might sound like, "I don't feel entirely certain about the final destination I'm moving toward, but I feel increasingly aligned with the direction itself." This reflects trust in process rather than fixation on outcome. Practice. Alignment matters more than arrival. Repeat twice. Advanced speakers often describe personal evolution through metaphor. For example, if I compare who I am today to who I was before, it feels less like a dramatic transformation and more like a gradual sharpening of focus. This metaphorical framing signals linguistic maturity. Repeat. Growth has refined my focus rather than rewritten my identity. Again, daily life conversations at this level also include articulating peace with ambiguity. For instance, I've become more comfortable holding unanswered questions without feeling pressured to resolve them immediately. This reflects intellectual patience. Practice. Uncertainty no longer unsettles me the way it once did. Repeat. Now imagine discussing fulfillment. Instead of saying, "Mom, I feel happy," you might express, "I feel a quiet sense of fulfillment lately, not constant, but steady enough to ground me." This communicates emotional stability rather than fleeting happiness. Repeat. Fulfillment feels calmer than excitement. Again. Advanced speakers also describe their relationship with ambition differently. For example, "My ambition has become more intentional, less driven by comparison, more guided by personal resonance." This reframes ambition into alignment. Practice. "My goals now reflect my values more than my ego." Repeat. Let's move into conversations about daily gratitude. A refined articulation might sound like, "I've begun noticing gratitude in smaller spaces, conversations, moments of stillness, even ordinary routines." This expresses mindfulness embedded in speech. Repeat. Gratitude often resides in overlooked moments. Again. Now imagine discussing emotional resilience after difficult phases. You might say, "Looking back, I can see how certain challenges strengthened emotional capacities I didn't know I possessed." This frames hardship as development. Practice. Difficulty expanded my emotional endurance. Repeat. Advanced daily conversations also involve expressing trust in personal timing. For example, "I've stopped comparing my pace to others. I'm learning to respect the rhythm of my own unfolding." This shows self-anchored progress. Repeat. My pace is part of my design. Again. Now let's enter a longer real-life reflection about life balance. Recently, I've been redefining what balance means to me. I used to imagine it as perfect equilibrium, equal distribution of time and energy. But now I see it as responsiveness, the ability to adjust depending on what life requires in each season. Some phases demand effort, others demand rest, and honoring both feels far healthier than forcing symmetry. Practice reading this paragraph slowly, letting the pacing feel conversational. At C1-C2 level, and speakers also articulate contentment with nuance. For instance, I don't feel that everything in my life is complete, but I do feel at peace with where I currently stand. This expresses grounded satisfaction. Repeat. Peace can exist alongside incompleteness. Again. Now imagine discussing lessons learned through experience. A reflective articulation might sound like, experience has taught me that clarity rarely arrives before action. It tends to follow it. This reframes uncertainty into courage. Practice. Action often precedes understanding. Repeat. Advanced speakers also describe their relationship with the future thoughtfully. For example, I think about the future, though I try not to burden it with unrealistic expectations. This shows emotional moderation. Repeat. Hope feels healthier when paired with realism. Again, let's move into conversations about emotional grounding. A nuanced daily theme. You might say, I've been focusing on grounding myself internally, so external fluctuations feel less destabilizing. This reflects psychological anchoring. Practice. Internal grounding creates external stability. Repeat. Now imagine discussing life satisfaction overall. A C2 level articulation could sound like, if I step back and observe my life from a wider perspective, I feel grateful for the trajectory, even if the path remains imperfect. This blends gratitude with realism. Repeat. Gratitude coexists with imperfection. Again. Let's now move into the final extended integrative monologue for deep shadowing practice. Lately, I've been reflecting on how far I've come, not just in visible accomplishment, but in awareness, patience, and emotional steadiness. I've learned that growth isn't always loud. Sometimes it unfolds quietly, through shifts in perception, through softened reactions, through deeper understanding of myself and others. And while I don't claim to have everything figured out, I do feel more at ease within my own journey, more trusting of its pace, and more appreciative of the lessons it continues to offer. Read this entire reflection slowly, twice, allowing your voice to carry calm confidence. And that is the essence of C1-C2 Daily Life English Conversation. It moves beyond functional communication into reflective expression, emotional articulation, philosophical observation, and deeply human storytelling. When you speak at this level, you're not just using English, you're embodying it, shaping your identity through it, and connecting with others through its emotional precision. Thank you for spending this time with me today, for listening, reflecting, and practicing with intention. Keep revisiting these reflections. Keep speaking them aloud. And most importantly, keep trusting your voice as it evolves. I'll see you again in the next session.